will, or gear or equipment to observe how the appearance or perception of the cyclist affects the passing behavior of the motorist and the proximity of the pass, which is, of course, a huge issue for all of us as cyclists. Why is it that motorists won't give us enough room? Is it that they don't know better? They're too lacking in skill. They're trying to terrorize us. They were never taught. It's very interesting to see what, if any, factors might affect that. So that was Ian's groundbreaking research, and really just one part of it. I know there's other research he did with many, many hours of recorded passes by motorists as he was cycling around with his gear. He's also an absolutely fabulous long-distance cyclist who does these amazing rides that I wish that I could do someday. I might be too far towards the twilight of my riding career to even attempt them, but you know, he has set the world record in traversing Europe in the north-south direction. He's done some other incredible ultra-distance rides, and he's going to talk about his research, his riding, and I asked him to please share a few thoughts with us, since really on both sides of the Atlantic we're now on lockdown, awaiting what might be the very worst of this virus, and starting to see some of its effects on thinking about the public and the private realm, about proximity amongst people in public, which, you know, is a completely different issue when it's a virus versus when it's traffic passing behavior. But in some ways, there's some real common factors. You know, last week we had Doug Gordon mention that now runners running on the sidewalk are like the new bicyclists. The pedestrians don't like the runners because they're running too close to them. They feel like they're being menaced by unmasked runners who might be spreading a contagion their way, much as cyclists are loathed on the sidewalk or even sometimes in the streets by pedestrians. So there's so much to talk about. I'm just going to let you take it away, Ian.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me here. And I'm very, very flattered to be asked to do this. I'm going to try and share my screen with you so I can show some slides. So fingers crossed this works. Steve will have to let me know if this is working.
It is.
Now, is it working now? Ooh, in a second, just loading. Come on, this has worked all afternoon. This is so typical. Okay. Oh, well, that's nice. My first slide is refusing to show. Is that visible? Hello? Hello?
Yes,
yes, that's visible. Looks good.
Okay, you can see all of that. Great. Okay, there we go. Right. So, yeah. So as Steve said, I don't want to say I live and breathe cycling, but I think I come at cycling from several different angles, and something I struggle with a certain amount, and something that might become apparent today is, and actually I'd be interested, I think Steve and some of you may be in similar positions to this, that, you know, I work in cycling and cycling safety, and so often I'm talking in that capacity as someone who works in the field, and in that sense, you know, I try to be very professional and fact-based and so on, but I'm also a person who rides a bike, and sometimes I talk about it from that perspective as well. And in my everyday life, I think I muddle those up somewhat, and it's entirely possible that's going to happen again tonight. In fact, it's very specifically going to happen tonight because I'm going to jump through these three things as asked. So I'm going to start off just telling you a bit about my background in long distance cycling, and especially my attempt on the world record for crossing Europe last year. Then I'll go on to some of the science stuff that I've worked on over the years. And in particular, what I'm going to try and do today is talk about some of the slightly bigger picture stuff that goes with this. And then, as requested, I've done some quickest of quick thoughts on what we might possibly learn from the current situation. Because, of course, we've got some really unprecedented stuff happening, which is going to, well, it's certainly changing the world right now. And I think it's interesting to think about how it might change things in the future.
Ian, just a
Yes.
quick point. It's been mentioned that your screen isn't right sized for the broadcast screen. We
Yes,
can't see
I
all
did
lines of text.
wonder. See, I wondered if that was what's going to happen. So, because I've got like a sort of quad HD screen. How is that?
It's a little bit better. You make it. That's good. That's perfect.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
That's great, because that also means I can secretly look at some notes off the side. Right. Okay, so I'll start off with the distance cycling stuff, because something I did quite recently was take on the record for crossing Europe. But just to give you the background on this, because one of the things that surprised me as much as anybody is that I found myself at a fairly serious level of ultra distance cycling, and it kind of came out of nowhere. So I just wanted to explain the strange series of events that led to me doing this, even though I wasn't ever planning to. So I really wasn't a cyclist until quite recently. I was actually a distance runner. So I used to do sort of 50, 100-mile runs. And you can see some photos from some of them here, including my attempt to run the Leadville 100 in Colorado, which went horribly, horribly wrong when the altitude wiped me out and I limped 60 miles and vomited everywhere. So that was quite exciting. So, you know, I was doing this running and I really, really enjoyed it. It was just such an amazing experience to take part in these events. I discovered that the people who take part in these things, that world of ultra distance running, it's just the nicest people on earth. I sort of joked once, a joke that I quite like is that the people you find in this world of long distance running, it's the direct opposite of banking. It's really, really hard work and there's no reward for doing it. And so it tends to attract really nice people who are just there for the sheer joy of doing these things. So I did this for quite a few years. And, you know, I learned so much. You cannot run 100 miles in a day without learning an awful lot about how you deal with difficulty. And that's kind of one of the themes I want to touch on today is just how much I've learned about dealing with adversity and learning how I can cope with difficult situations by pushing myself through these kind of things. So the running was incredible. I took part in a whole load of races in various parts of the world. And I always did okay, but not great. You know, typically with these races, I would finish somewhere around about the top 10%. So, you know, good, but not top class. But I loved it. Now, the thing I should just say is that I've always had a really, really impetuous streak. And you can probably see that quite well if I show you my running history in graphical form. So here it is. So as you can see, for basically a long, long, long time, I did zero sport of any sort. I did no running, no cycling. I sat around drinking beer and watching TV. And then a friend now the thing is, it's really hard to say this without sounding like I had a midlife crisis, but it's pure coincidence that it was just before my 40th birthday. A friend sent me a video of this ultra running race, and said, look at this, I think we should do this. And this particular video was so captivating. It was this race in the Canary Islands. You ran up a volcano, round the top, back down the other side. It was and I just wrote back to him immediately and said, right, okay, yes, we are doing this. And as you can see from this graph, I just went from no running to running thousands of kilometers a year overnight. And just got completely sucked into it. And so I did these like 3 years of quite serious running, starting from nothing, and then suddenly just gave it all up. And the reason I just gave it all up so suddenly was I discovered long distance cycling. And the thing that grabbed me there was this race, the Transcontinental Race, which some of you might well know about because it gets quite a lot of attention. So again, this was another completely impetuous decision. I was just reading a webpage one day and I stumbled across this article on Strava. Actually, it was a photo essay on Strava describing the Transcontinental Race in, I think it was 2016. And I was looking at this and it looked unbelievable. It looked so hard. It was just all these photos of people collapsed asleep in corners and dribbling food down their own faces. And I thought, wow, that looks amazing. I think I've got some sort of masochistic streak. And the thing that absolutely grabbed me, the thing that made me just go, I have got to do long distance cycling, was I became absolutely captivated with the idea of putting my life on hold and just giving myself over to something that took such a long time. I'd done these long running races that maybe lasted a day, and it would be the most intense day of your life. To run 100 miles in a day is an unbelievably intense experience, but you can do it in 24 hours. And it was the thought of, well, what's it like to hand yourself over to some difficult physical challenge that lasts for weeks? And I just had to know what that was like. And so I basically stopped running overnight, bought a bike, and started doing some big kilometers. And I got a place in the 2017 Transcontinental Ride and just went in completely blind, no expectations, no idea how good I was, no idea how good anybody else was. I just went in there to see what it would be like. And it was this extraordinary experience of blasting myself across Europe. It was so hard. It was amazing. The route took me over incredible mountain passes. I had to really, really dig deep, and I really discovered some things about how you keep going in these sorts of situations. I was looking through photos earlier and I found this one. I hope you can see it. This was an early obsession with weight saving, because you have to be slightly maniacal about shaving weight off on these things. So even at that stage, I was drilling holes in toothbrushes. Now, as it went, that race kind of started well. I actually found I was going a lot faster than I ever had dreamt I would go. And I found at the first checkpoint, I was up, relatively far up the field. I think there was something like 250, 300 people in the race. And I got to the first checkpoint and was about 25th or something like that. And I thought, oh my God, yeah, I'm actually going faster than most people here. And at that point I thought, right, okay, just imagine if I got to the top 10, just think how incredible that would be to be top 10 in this race when I've never done this before. And I was actually towards it. So over the next 1,000 miles or so, I was creeping up the field. I had various setbacks, but then I kept making progress and I went up the field. And then I just had the most disastrous 3 days across Romania and Serbia. I had inner tube failure after inner tube failure, mechanical problems. I lost so much time and ended up finishing the race all the way back in about 25th, 26th position, right back where I'd been at the start. But it had gone so much better than I ever imagined. So the following year, I thought, okay, given that I proved to be much better at that than I thought I was going to be, let's try something similar. Let's try and build on that. And so I looked around and I found this, which is a very similar sort of race called the North Cape 4000. And this was a really interesting experience. So this race is organized by two Italian guys. And it takes a different route every year, but it always goes from northern Italy to the very northern point of Europe called North Cape. And each year taking a different route. So this ride did it went this quite easterly route through Czechia, Poland, Baltic states, up through Finland, up to Norway. And something kind of interesting happened as I was doing it, something that I really had never expected. And I should say, just for background, when I was at school, when I was at university, I just did no sport. It's a bit like that graph I showed earlier. I had no interest in sport. I had no sporting background. I didn't understand people who did it. And then something happened on this race that changed everything. So about maybe halfway through the race, going through the Baltic states, somewhere in Latvia, I had an opportunity to get to the front of the race. So I'd been plodding along in maybe sort of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th position for 1,000 kilometers, 1,200 kilometers. And we'd all, there's a bunch of us there who were all kind of similar ability. And we kept leapfrogging each other all the time. And, every time you stopped at a shop, you'd bump into somebody, and it was quite nice. And then there was this section in Latvia of really filthy dirt roads. Just the most appalling gravel junk you can imagine riding on. And the route was fixed, but the organisers had said, for this one section where the road is bad, if you want to detour around it, you can. And some people detoured around, and I thought, I'm going to go for it. And so I hammered this gravel section and managed through this to get to the front of the race. And then I was so pleasantly shocked that I'd got to the front of the race. I put in this ridiculous stint. I rode right through the night, crossed the whole of Estonia in a night, and then hopped on a ferry to Helsinki and up through Finland and Norway. And it was a really strange experience. So on the one hand, just within me, it really just out of completely nowhere, this competitive urge just appeared. And I'd never, I'd gone like 44 years not suspecting I had this. And then it just appeared there. And then followed that was something that I'd never suspected before, which was the absolute stress and difficulty of being in the front of a race for that length of time. So I literally did 1,000-mile breakaway in this race and spent something like 4 or 5 days being chased the entire length of Scandinavia by 200 other riders. And it was kind of extraordinary what an effect that was, because over that length of time, you can spend so long in your own head. Obviously, you're just riding all day by yourself, thinking your own thoughts. And when you're being chased like that, it becomes incredibly difficult because you're just constantly worrying about logistics, worrying about something going wrong, worrying about the guy behind catching up. But thankfully, I managed to get to the end. This here is the very, very last point in Europe. And thankfully, I was able to get there ahead of everyone else. So everything went right in the end, but it was a flipping stressful event. And actually my partner, who's in bed, so she can't contradict me, but I was still having stress dreams about this 3 months later. From that, I would still wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning dreaming that I couldn't pack my bags, or that I was getting punctures or something like this. So maybe I'm not really mentally cut out for these things. So that takes us to last year. And I wanted to just try and build on what I'd done. And now I realized I was actually quite good at putting up with extreme boredom and putting up with a lot of discomfort on a saddle. I thought, well, okay, how can I capitalize on this? And the idea I hit upon was to try and break this record. So there are 2 records for crossing Europe. There's an east-west record, where you go from, can you see my mouse cursor? Is that visible? If you can see my mouse cursor, you go from here in Portugal over to here in Russia. So that's the east-west record. But I decided to go for the north-south record, which goes from the very northern tip of Norway, which is where I just finished that other race, down to the very southern tip in Spain. And I did a bit of looking around. And one of the reasons I decided to go for this is I thought that the current record is actually quite breakable. So here's the history of the records that have been going on. And the original record had been set by someone who, frankly, was having a holiday. And then it has been beaten by Paul Spencer. And then it was beaten by this chap, Lee Fancourt, who was actually a very, very serious hardcore rider. But when I looked at that figure of sort of 21 and a half days, I thought, that's beatable. If I can go a bit further each day than I did on the North Cape 4000, I can beat that. And so I set out to have a go at it. Now, what was interesting, obviously, when you're looking through the record books and you spot this and you think, I think I could beat that record, then obviously you have to hope that nobody else notices. But unfortunately, in my case, that's not true. And at least 2 other people noticed that this record was ripe for beating. And here they are. The top one is Ryan Anderson. The bottom one is Rob Gardner, who, by weird coincidence, both live quite near me. They're both only about 50 miles from here, which is very strange given it's a global record. But yeah, so I found out that they were doing the same thing. And I did at that point what any of us would do, which was to spend every waking moment stalking them on Strava. And once I got a fairly good idea of their abilities, I got in touch. And so we all had a chat with each other and got it out in the open. And basically, I discovered that Rob on the bottom there was going to set off about 3 weeks before me. And so if everything went to plan, he'd be finishing a few days before I started. And Ryan was planning to start shortly after me. So this was going to be interesting. And then it got even more interesting about 3 days before I went, when Rob went and flipping well broke the record. And he broke it quite convincingly. He knocked 2 days off the previous record. And so I flew up to Norway knowing that the job had just got a whole lot harder. Just very briefly, just because if any of you do distance riding, distance racing, I think this might be interesting. I just wanted to give you a quick idea of the level of detail that went into the planning. Because when you're riding for 2 weeks or more and trying to do something like 400 kilometers a day, I had a mantra, which was, I wanted to do all my thinking at home and do zero thinking on the road. And so as part of that, I sat here at my kitchen table, as I am now, and I spent a lot of hours poring over my planned route. And I hope you can see this. That's the level of detail that went into the planning. So what you can see there is just Poland. And you can see down the left-hand side, the first sort of 200 kilometers. And basically, I had everything marked. I had found every shop, every gas station, every supermarket. I had all of them planned and marked on the map in my cycle computer. I knew the opening times of most of them. Nothing was left to chance on the planning. And It took a long time, but it was worth absolutely every moment for the peace of mind it brought on the road. So if anyone's planning anything similar, do your planning. And so that takes us here. This is Nordkapp, the very northernmost point in Norway, 71 degrees north. And you can see that I got a bit poetic about it, and I set off at midday on the middle of Midsummer's Day, which I thought was a nice time to do it. I had to pick a date, and that seemed like as good as any. And so here's how the first few days unraveled. The first few days were tough. It was windy, it was cold, it rained. I mean, this is the Arctic, and even in the middle of summer, the Arctic is flipping Arctic. It was tough conditions, windy and blowy, and you know, got quite tough at times. But it's really beautiful up there. Just to show you a couple of little things up there. It's so wild, it's so remote, it's so empty. There are these reindeer wandering everywhere, wild out there. It's the most peaceful, glorious. The air is the freshest air you will ever experience. I can't recommend this part of the world enough. And this is interesting. This is the moment I crossed the Arctic Circle coming south. And there's a couple of things to notice here. The first, you might just be able to see the time. This is 3 o'clock in the morning because it was midsummer, so we had the midnight sun. And goodness me, that was convenient. One of the tricks I discovered doing this was the best way to organize a day when you're riding all day. The best way to organize it is to start really, really early, like maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. And the advantage of that is you can do the first maybe 100 kilometers while everybody else is still asleep. So that's a really nice thing. You get the roads to yourself for a few hours. And it also means that if you started your day really early, you finish your day early. And that means you roll into a town at the end of the day at maybe, let's say, 8 o'clock in the evening. The shops are open, the hotels are open, you can find things. It was such a convenient, efficient way of doing the ride. And nowhere was it better than the Arctic, because starting at 2 o'clock in the morning, it was still completely daylight. It was absolutely wonderful, as you can see here. The other thing to notice here is just, hopefully you can see just how little I was carrying. 2 bags, bag in the frame for the day. So that had things that I might need on the ride. Bag in the frame, bag at the back for evening. So that was essentially a sleeping bag, bivy bag, and tools and things that I hoped I wouldn't need. So it was absolutely minimal. There was no extra clothes, no extra anything, pure minimal kit. The thing that people always ask me about when they learn that I do long distance riding is nutrition, sports nutrition. You know, you're all cyclists, you must be aware, whatever type of cycling you do, you'll be aware that there's this massive sports nutrition industry trying to sell you stuff. Well, the thing is, when you do ultra distance riding, none of that is any use. I cannot carry 2 weeks of food in those bags. So the reality is that when you're out on the road, this is what you eat. You eat junk from McDonald's, you eat anything you can find in gas stations, you eat these things, the 7 days croissant, which is the most rancid packet of sugar you can possibly get your hands on, but they're incredibly cheap and you can buy them all over Eastern Europe. You can also, and this is one of the great discoveries in Latvia, you can buy a kilogram of yogurt in a bag. Now, this is intended to last a family for a week, but I discovered you can get that down your throat in about 12 seconds in an emergency. And that's about 1,500 calories in 12 seconds. It's so efficient. And this is the sort of thing you find yourself doing when you do these races. Down through Scandinavia took me to the bit of this ride that I was most nervous about, which was Russia. So there's no way to do this without going through Russia, which is quite an experience. The route here took me through St. Petersburg, which is a huge city, and it is the most insane place I've ever ridden a bicycle. It is like, I, I, I said at the time, I don't know why Russian cars have windscreens, because nobody ever looks out of them. Everybody is looking at their phone the whole time. I was on these enormous roads, and I'd like stop at some traffic lights and just watch 3 cars smash into each other right next to me, and nobody seems to care. It's just unbelievable. It was so dangerous, so horrible. I'm just really thankful to get out of there with my life. And I'm not saying this just to deter other people from having a go at the record. It really was. It was really like nothing I've seen anywhere else that I've ever ridden. So yes, that took me down through the Baltic states into Poland. And then things started to get quite tough in Poland. I mean, this map won't mean much to you. This is Poland and Germany here. But what happened here was the beginning of a 7-day headwind. So I had 7 days of grinding into these absolutely brutal headwinds. And this is where all of my experience came to the fore. This is where all the stuff I'd learned from running, all the stuff I'd learned from putting myself through difficult situations came out. And one of the things I've kept thinking about all the time was there are certain sayings used by ultra distance runners and riders, which when you're in this sort of situation of trying to spend day after day after day pushing yourself through a really hard situation, these sayings become really useful. This is one of them. It never always gets worse. And it's true on these rides, and it's also kind of a life lesson as well. Sometimes you're in a really bad situation, and the next thing that happens is that situation gets worse, and then after that it gets worse again, but it never always gets worse. And you have to remind yourself of this and think, look, if I just keep moving forward at any speed at all, it doesn't matter what speed I move forward, as long as I keep moving forward, this will turn around eventually. And it becomes this absolute mind over matter process of forcing yourself to keep going when you feel terrible, just sort of consciously having to remind yourself, it will get better. If you can just keep turning the pedals, it will get better. And sometimes even that was hard. And sometimes you had to break this down to the most absolutely elemental part, which was just reach the next tree. You know, there would be days where I would ride 400 kilometers, 250 miles, one tree at a time. And again, it's one of those sort of metaphors that stretches to other areas of your life. 250 miles, you can't think about the end of the day when you're riding 250 miles, but you can think about the next tree. And as long as you trust the process and believe that getting to the next tree, and then the next tree, and then the next tree, as long as you believe that that isn't you going forward, the 250 miles will finish. And it's a great reminder, and it was genuinely very visceral and true at the time, of just how trusting the process can be so important, and looking at the process rather than the outcome. You can't just do 250 miles, you've just got to do the process. So then that took me across France, over the Pyrenees into Spain. It's very nice. I had some lovely accommodation. This is me sleeping in a bus shelter at some grim little French village here. I crossed the border into Spain early in the morning. That's what this very sunny photograph here in the bottom is. Climbed over the Pyrenees on a very hot day, crossed the Spanish border. And then I have got to say, at the risk of sounding like the Spanish tourist board, cycling in Spain is incredible. It is just wonderful. It's a beautiful country, but also, my God, the roads. It is just thousands of kilometers of glorious, smooth surface with no vehicles on it. They've recently, in the last few years, built loads and loads of new freeways. And so all the old roads are still there, running parallel on these nice flat surfaces with nobody else around. So riding through Spain was glorious. And even though at this point I'd done 3,500 miles of riding, I was able to really make some progress through Spain. So I did most of the country in 2 days. And here's the figures. So I did 392 kilometers, had 3 hours sleep with a very, very confused hotel guy. So I checked into a hotel. 3 hours later, I checked out. I handed the key to the porter and he said, "Is there a problem with your room?" No, that's it. I'm just off again. Back on the road, and then did this ridiculously long 545 kilometer stint to finish off. That final stint after 16 days was hard. It was the closest I've ever come to hallucinating on a bike. People who do these really long distances talk about hallucinations sometimes, and I've never experienced it before. But I had this strange thing. I mean, you can see the route on the map there. And towards the end, as I rode through the night in the absolute darkness, it's so dark down there, all I could see was the road. I could just see the little bit of road lit by my headlamp for hour after hour after hour. And I almost became convinced there was nothing else. It was like everything to the side just didn't exist. All that existed was the road ahead of me. And I just became utterly fixated on it. And thankfully, that kept me going the right direction, because then I managed to get to the end. So this is the arrival. This is me getting to the very southern tip of Europe. There's a causeway there that goes out to an island, and this is the official end of the route. And what was really interesting, and this is where I can actually put a little bit of psychology on this, the experience of finishing something like this depends who you are. There's actually this idea in psychology of that we all sit at one end or the other of a continuum. And actually, I'd suggest you all have a little think where you sit on this continuum. So at one end, you've got people who their personality is they kind of focus on gains. They focus on achieving things. And so when something goes really well for them, they're the people who go, yes, I did it. And then at the other end, you've got the people who aren't focused on gaining things. You've got the people who are focused on nothing going wrong. You've got the people who are focused on no losses. And that's me. I'm very much at that end. The experience of winning the North Cape 4000 race and the experience of breaking this world record were the same. It was, I got to the finish and my body would just slump, and it was, it's over, nothing's gone wrong, it's now finished. There was no punching the air, there was no cheering, and it's just a reflection of what my personality is like. I'm not about punching the air and yelping. I'm about, okay, I did it, we made it, nothing went wrong. And I think it's just interesting to reflect on where each of us sits on that spectrum. So that's the new record as of 9 months ago. 6,367 kilometers, 16 days, 20 hours, 59 minutes. So an average of 377 kilometers a day, which is quite hard, if I'm honest, but totally worth it. So that's the official recognition from the Guinness World Records people. That certificate now sits just around the corner here on my wall. And so the whole thing is now official. Hooray.
Before you move on to the next part of the talk, Ian, I just noticed a couple of remarks, and I'll draw your attention to the fact that there is a chat bar that you can click on and see I don't want to distract you, but there's also questions and answers. This is for everyone who's attending virtually. And you had no support for this? There was no one carrying anything for you? Or
That's
even
right. No, yeah, completely unsupported. No, actually, for the races have to be unsupported, and it's very strict. For the record, you can do it both ways. But I chose to do it unsupported. And actually, what was interesting is I had a little secret ambition that I didn't tell anybody at all before I did it. So the record for the East-West crossing Europe had been broken the year before by someone who did it supported. And he averaged 370 kilometers a day. And my little secret ambition was to do better than that unsupported. And I just managed it. So I was 7 kilometers a day faster than him, even though I didn't have the support. And that was my little secret ambition there, which I was really pleased with. So yeah, completely unsupported. Find your own food, find your own accommodation, deal with everything yourself.
Okay. Just a couple other things. There's an unnatural fascination with your chamois and its condition and what steps you might have taken to decontaminate it along the way. Also a request that if you can somehow increase your volume, that would be great. Everyone would appreciate it.
Okay, right. Well, let me do the sound first. Is that any better?
It is.
Ah, superb. Oh, we should have done that ages ago. I'll start again. Yeah, and the chamois, well, in terms of looking after it, I had one pair of shorts. And what you do is when you get in a shower, you throw the shorts on the floor and jump up and down on them a bit. And then you wrap them in a towel, stand on one end, wring the towel out to squeeze all the moisture out and hope they're dry for the morning, basically. So yeah, it's, you know, to be honest, well, actually, interestingly, and I've got to say this because I was sponsored by a chamois cream company, but I didn't, on this record attempt, I didn't have any friction problems at all. I have in previous years, but last year I didn't have any friction problems. I did end up just sore from, 16, 17 hours a day of just sitting on the same spot. That just hurts after a while. But yeah, no friction problems at all. Actually, I was really, really lucky. Okay, so quick reflections on what I learned from that. First, it was really hard, but obviously, otherwise everyone would do it. But it was so satisfying, to take on something so daunting, so huge, and to do it was unbelievably satisfying. Now, here's an interesting one. I've said this once or twice before, and this seems to be the thing that everybody remembers me saying. The sorts of jobs a lot of us do these days, it's really hard to know when you've finished, and it's really hard to know if you've done it well. Because so much of our work these days is all sorts of little unconnected tasks, and you jump from this and you jump to that. When do you actually, it's not, my work is not like a carpenter where when the table is finished, I've finished my job and I can see that it's done well. And it was so nice for once to do something where I clearly finished and clearly finished well, because I don't get that in my life normally, and sport provides that in a way I don't get elsewhere. Racing is much harder than riding. The additional stress and strain of trying to be super fast the whole time is mentally surprisingly tough, at least for me, which is something I've learned along the way. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the other great things is that this kind of endurance sport, this setting yourself incredibly difficult challenges and pushing through them, just is a place to learn how to cope. It's a safe environment where you can test yourself. It's a place where you can make your life hard for a while and practice how you deal with that. And I think that's a really healthy thing to do, to learn how to cope with difficulty at a time of your own choosing. For me, at least, the only way you can possibly accomplish these really, really big, difficult things is to focus on the process, not the outcomes. Just stay focused on, what do I need to do next? What do I need to do now? and the outcome will emerge from that as long as you do it well. Again, that's another very transferable lesson. You can always, no matter how bad you feel, you can always just do a little bit more, maybe just that next tree. And despite all that, my main reflection is I've still not found the limit, which is quite an interesting thing to say. Whew, which takes us on to a sort of completely unrelated another part, which is, it feels really strange to change gear so suddenly and move on to this. So that's what I do in my spare time. Let's now look at what I do in the office. I'm an environmental psychologist, and I split my time across a few things. So what I won't talk about today is I do work on things like energy consumption, water consumption, helping people use less energy or water in their home, helping architects design energy efficient buildings and that kind of thing. So I do a load of work on that. But the thing that's relevant here is I do work on travel choices. So why do people travel the way they do? And I do work on safety of vulnerable road users, particularly cyclists. Now, I've done a bit of work on motorcyclists and things like that as well, but the cycling is obviously the thing that's most relevant to you. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'll kind of come back to this later, is the fact that cycling kind of sits in a middle zone. It sits in a grey area. And as I described here in this book, it's neither one thing nor the other. We don't mix well with pedestrians because we're faster than them. And we don't mix well with motorists because we're slower than them. And it's almost like nobody wants us. You know, the moment you get on a bike, the people you were walking with reject you. Or if you take a bike out of the back of a car, the people you're driving with reject you. So how do we accommodate these middle range vehicles? And of course, some people's answer will be, well, we shouldn't. They should grow up and get a car, is some people's answers. But of course, that's not practical. I did try and look earlier, and I couldn't find the US figures for this. But here in Britain, the majority of journeys, the majority of all of our journeys annually are short enough you could do them on a bike. You know, a quarter of all our journeys are less than 2 miles. The majority of our journeys are less than 5 miles, and that is every single journey that anybody does in this country. So we could be cycling for millions and millions of journeys every year. And so that's why the bicycle can't just go away. It's why we need to stay a thorn in the side of city planners and politicians, because it is the answer to a huge swathe of our journeys, and we need to be able to make it safe and convenient. One of the things I've particularly looked at in that area, and the thing that I think I'm probably best known for, is work on overtaking of cyclists by drivers. So this is a photo from quite a few years ago when I first started looking at this and still had dark hair, where and you know, this was the beginning of a strand of research where I went out, or my colleagues went out, and we measured genuine overtaking behavior from people in the street who didn't know they were being studied. So we were looking at their more natural behavior, and we found a bunch of things. So we found that drivers can respond to how you look. So these data, for example, are the slightly notorious data from when I rode with and without a helmet. And the red data are the passing distances when I wore a helmet, the blue data are when I didn't. And you can see that everything shifts across. So pop a helmet on, all the overtakes start to become a bit closer on average. So people do respond. Drivers can look at you, make a decision, and they're able to respond to how you look. They're also able to respond to gender. So one of the things that I looked at in early work was I stuck a long wig on to look more feminine in an experiment that has amused people around the world. And, you know, sticking a long wig on, just immediately people started to give me a lot more space. And interestingly, that's been replicated with real women in various places. So that was replicated in Taiwan, it was replicated in Florida. With real men and women get given more space by passing motorists on average, which is a slightly strange thing. The one exception to that is Australia, where they hate cyclists regardless of gender. And then another interesting thing, and this is probably particularly interesting to Steve, we did a follow-up study which suggested that the fear of punishment might be a particular issue. So we compared all of these outfits that you can see here. Now, the two that were particularly interesting, or the two we were particularly looking at, were the red one, the sort of kind of serious sport rider, hardcore experienced rider look, and the one next to it that says novice cyclist pass slowly. Now, the idea of those two outfits was to compare what happens if you look experienced versus inexperienced. And I still laugh at this. It was really easy to choose an outfit that says experienced rider. It's like just basically wear some sports gear. And we all sat round in my colleague's house one evening trying to decide what outfit says you're inexperienced. And we spent hours discussing options. And in the end, we just wrote it on the back, novice rider, which I loved the directness of it. So we were particularly interested in comparing experience versus inexperience. But as we were doing it, we thought we'd check all these other outfits as well. There's a couple of interesting ones. So the one on the far right, I don't know if you have these in the States, but they're vests that are designed to look like they're police outfits, but they say polite instead of police. Do you have those? No. Yeah, they're quite a big thing over here, and a lot of cyclists wear them, and actually a lot of horse riders wear them. Loads of horse riders here wear them, and they're designed to look like police outfits, just with a letter changed. The one next to it is interesting as well, because it's from a company called policewitness.com, which says that you've got a video camera. So it says that the rider is recording with a video. And what we found, interestingly, all of the outfits were treated exactly the same. None of them got any favoritism at all. The two interesting things, the only one that got any extra space at all from passing drivers was the one that said that the rider was videoing the journey. So that's why I say it might be fear of retribution that controls drivers more than anything else. The other very interesting one was, although it was hard to measure, there were quite a few drivers who became deliberately aggressive to the sort of fake police outfit. Now, this says polite. It's one letter difference from police. And drivers were quite able to tell the difference. So when drivers are saying, oh, I didn't see this, I didn't see that, they can tell the difference between police and polite from 50 yards away. So it becomes hard to agree that in general, drivers struggle to see us when they can tell the difference between police and polite, one letter difference from 50 yards away, which I think in itself is kind of an interesting finding. So there's some of the sort of direct studies I've done on overtaking behavior. But I think what's really interesting is to look at what these say about some bigger issues that are also going to be relevant to you. One of the really interesting bigger issues is that legally, motorists are allowed to get lucky. Motorists are allowed to roll the dice, and if things fall in their favor, then the legal systems of most countries, in fact, I think every country, the legal system tends to say, that's okay. And here's the sort of underpinning idea behind this. So this is the collision pyramid. I don't know if anyone's seen this before. This comes from a research called Hayden back in the 1980s. And the idea is, and the reason this is done as a pyramid, is as you move from the bottom to the top, you've got an increasing number of events. So basically, that big blue block is saying most interactions between road users are fine. The majority of incidents, nothing happens. Then on top of that, the red zone are potential conflicts. This is where two people on the road interact in such a way that something might have gone wrong. And then, of course, there are slight conflicts, serious conflicts, collisions, and the number gets smaller each time. And then as you look at the collisions, which is the little blown up section, you've got minor collisions, slight injury collisions, serious injury collisions, and fatal collisions, the number getting smaller each time. So basically, the more serious the incident, the fewer there are. But critically, and this is the thing I was drawing attention to, the boundaries are kind of probabilistic. They're a chance difference. The difference between a near miss and a collision is not really down to clever action on the part of the driver. The difference between a near miss and a collision can just as easily be pure luck. You know, you can imagine two parallel universes where the same people interact, and in this universe, the cyclist had a smooth bit of road. In this universe, there was a pothole, and in that universe, the collision happens. Now, in both cases, where in one universe, the cyclist gets lucky, in the other universe, they don't, the driver's actions were the same. The driver was passing too close in both of these incidences, and it's just that they got away with it in one case and didn't get away with it in the other. And it's interesting to think, well, should the legal system take that more seriously? Should the legal system say that any near miss that should have been avoided is as serious as a collision? Because the reason, the only reason it wasn't a collision is luck. And are you not as culpable if your actions were the same? So it's just an interesting thing to think about. And one of the reasons I draw attention to that is because everything I'm going to mention here is about big picture systemic stuff. So one of the first big picture systemic issues that I think about a lot is how the legal system condones things that maybe we don't want it to condone. Another interesting big picture thing is that as a culture, we view motor danger differently to other danger. So I just want to show you this. This is, I should just say, if I do strange pauses, it's because when I change the slides, I have to wait until the light changes on the faces I can see, so I can tell that the slides have changed at the other end. So this here is what's called the hierarchy of controls. This is the universal system for how you are meant to deal with a danger. So let's say you're in a workplace. Let's say you work in a factory and there's something in that factory that is dangerous or hazardous. This is how you deal with it. Step one, get rid of the hazard. If something's dangerous, if you're working with a chemical, for example, and it's dangerous, the first thing you should try is to get rid of the danger, eliminate it. If for some reason that's not possible, you should substitute the hazard with something safer, or you should physically separate people so they cannot get to the dangerous place, or you should have engineering systems that protect people from this danger. If for some reason you can't do all of those things, you should then have rules that mean that people never come to harm. And then the absolute last step, which is the least effective and the least likely to work, and you should only do this if every other step has proved impossible, The very last option is personal protective equipment. Now, what do we get when we ride on bikes? Do we get the cars taken away? Level one, the first thing you should try. No. Do we get the hazard substituted with something safer? No. We get pickup trucks and SUVs, which are actually the opposite of that. Do we get isolated from the hazard? Generally not. We have to mix with them and hope for the best. Do we have engineering systems that protect us? Nope. We have the opposite of that. Do we have an administrative system? Do we have a legal system that makes drivers afraid of hurting us? Nope. What do we get? Plastic hats. And this system that I'm showing you here shows that the plastic hat, the high-vis vest, they should be they are the worst option. They are the worst way to keep a person safe. And yet the way our society tends to view cycling is, well, that's all you get. And so again, in terms of big picture systemic stuff, the way we view risk as a culture is different in other areas like a factory versus the road. And just as a final point on this, one of the places this becomes particularly interesting is if you work in a factory, they have to deal with it this way. If you work in a warehouse, they have to look at it this way. If you work on the road, and of course, remember that millions of people, their job is on the road. There's none of this. Your employer has no duty to keep you safe if your job happens to be on the road rather than in an office. So again, very interesting that as a culture, we view cycling as a different thing. Another place where the culture goes slightly weird is that we forget our morals. People can be very nice, but they can also, in certain situations, forget that they're nice. And I set out with a couple of colleagues recently to try and measure this. So we employed a national opinion polling company to phone 1,000 people, 2,500 people around Britain. And everybody got either version A or version B of the questions. And the questions were exactly the same, except for version A, they were about everyday life, and for version B, they were about driving. But the questions were the same. The principle was the same. We just changed one or two words. So it would go from being about driving to being about not driving. So there's an example on the slide here. Version A, do you agree people shouldn't smoke in populated areas where others have to breathe the cigarette fumes? Version B of the same question, do you agree people shouldn't drive in populated areas where others have to breathe the car fumes? And you might not be surprised that the answers to the same question are completely different if it's about cars or cigarettes. The nation basically completely agrees. Of course, you shouldn't make people breathe your cigarette smoke. But if it's car smoke, they go, oh yeah, no, that's fine. Obviously, that's fine. The principle is the same. The moral imperative is exactly the same in these two questions. The question is it okay to make a stranger breathe toxic fumes? And it turns out the answer is, well, it depends where the fumes come from. So again, as a big picture cultural thing, we are just weird when it comes to cars. We see this another way in that victim blaming is official policy. I won't say a lot about this, but just here are some official government road safety messages to children from various parts of the world. And the message to children is, if you die, it's your fault, essentially. And that's official from government agencies. So I think it's just, again, interesting as a reflection of our cultural position on driving. And again, as a big picture thing, as a physical thing, we build our towns for cars and then wonder why people get hurt when they walk or cycle. So I'm just going to show you one thing here. This is a photograph from very close to my house. This is actually the road I cross if I go to the shop near my house. And hopefully what you can see is the road is 4.8 meters wide because we have very small roads here. So the road is 4.8 meters wide. The bit where you cross is 11 meters wide. And the reason it's so wide where you cross is because the junction is flared outwards where the two roads meet. And the reason it's flared out is so that motorists do not need to slow down at all as they turn in or turn out of the side street. Now, this is a brilliant example of how physical, hard infrastructure design affects safety. The road has been designed by people who have, their only priority is to move motor vehicles quickly. And if the only thing that mattered was to move motor vehicles quickly, then this design makes a lot of sense. But of course, that's not the only thing that matters. What matters is the human beings crossing this road, as hundreds do every day. And not only have you ensured that they are exposed to danger for twice as long, you've also ensured that the danger is increased because you have built it so that the cars will be going faster while pedestrians are in that danger zone. So as an illustration of the role of the built environment, this is fantastic, but we mustn't forget the reason this bit of built environment is so poor is because it's a reflection of our cultural norms and our cultural standards, as have been those previous things I've shown you. So this is all very gloomy. Basically, I'm suggesting that we're all doomed, which frankly, right now, none of us need. So I thought I'd try and just finish with some slightly more optimistic avenues here. Because I really feel that all of those things I've shown you could easily be turned around. They could very easily be turned around. So for example, that study with the cigarette smoke versus car fumes, it shows that people do have morals and values. It shows that people do have opinions about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in public. It's just that in this one context, we apply the wrong ones. So that's fixable. Another cause for hope is that people don't actually like driving. Now, this is maybe a slightly surprising claim, but we've measured it. So have a look at this. This here is from a study of quite a large number of commuters. Again, maybe I think there's 2,000 or 3,000 people going into this. And what you've got on the measurement is how it's a sort of a fairly complex combined measure of the emotional experience of your commute. And it combined various facets together. And you can see that people who walk to work, people who cycle to work, they have a really positive time. That they actively enjoy their journeys every day. People who take the bus don't, because frankly the buses aren't that good. But look at the car, and I think this is fascinating. It's not positive, it's not negative. It is completely zero. It is like 0.0 on average across thousands of people. I think this shows that driving isn't special, it's just normative. Everybody does it, but they do it because that's just what you do. They're not tied to it, they're not wedded to it. It doesn't make them happy, it's just what everybody else does, and so it's what they do. And so I think that's a cause for hope. Now, if that claim is true, if it's true that people don't actually like driving, why do people get so scared when you say you want to stop them doing it? And I'm going to tell you my theory. You might have seen this quote before. This is a quote from Henry Ford, who said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I think this is a very interesting and powerful quote in this context, because what he was suggesting there is Obviously, in reality, everybody wanted his product. Everybody didn't want horses, they wanted cars. They didn't know that. All that people have ever wanted is efficient mobility. All that people have ever wanted is the ability to go from one place to another, to go home, to go to work, to go to the shops, to go to school, to see their friends, to socialize, to go to a bar. That's all anybody has ever wanted. And they always express it in the language and concepts of the time. Now, today, in our time, people use cars to express mobility. When people say, I like driving, I would suggest that in a lot of cases, there are exceptions. Obviously, there are petrol heads who are like into cars. But in many cases, your average person, when they say they like to drive, what they're actually saying is, I like having mobility. I like the ability to go places. But they use the term drive because we've set up society so that that is how you get mobility. And it's really hard to have mobility without driving. So it's not surprising that people use that term. But then that leads to this situation, that because for a lot of people, driving equals mobility, or mobility, the ability to go places, equals driving. If you say to people, I think you should drive less, they don't hear, I think you should drive less. They hear, I think you should travel less. And I would suggest that's at the root of the reaction against any suggestion that people drive less, that people feel you are clipping their wings. They feel we are suggesting that they just lock themselves in their homes and never go anywhere. Whereas, of course, we know we're suggesting travel as much as before, just travel better. But people don't hear that because the car is so wedded in our culture. And as a final thought, and I've gone slightly too long, which I'm sorry about, but as a final thought, this is an idea I had about road safety a while ago. And
I'm going to jump in and interrupt Ian just for a second.
Okay, yeah.
And draw the attention of those still with us, which is most of you, to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It will appear there if you take the cursor arrow and hover it at the bottom of your screen. You'll see Q&A. Click on it, and you can type in a question. Please use that and not the chat, and it'll be a much easier way for me to get to Ian questions you might want him to try to address. So, go ahead.
Good idea, yes. Okay, so yes, as a final thought, and I think for any of you who are interested in advocacy, for any of you who are interested in making our streets better, changing the design, changing our cultural norms, changing the way people use our streets, whichever level you're going for, this is my thought. The burden of proof has to be on people who advocate the status quo, not on those of us who advocate change. Now, this is how we are resisted. Those of us who advocate making our streets safer are resisted because the burden of proof is always placed onto us. Yeah, if we were to put that bike lane in, it will destroy the local economy. Prove me wrong. And then nothing ever happens. If we put that bike lane in, it will increase pollution. Prove me wrong. And of course you can't because they never build it. At the moment, we have millions of people globally dying of air pollution. We have over 1 million people a year dying of collisions. The burden of proof is not on us. The burden of proof is on anyone who resists change. And we must remind them of that at every opportunity. Very finally, this is what Steve asked me to think about. So I spent a short time earlier today doing what I believe the kids call hot takes on the current situation. I think what we see, I think we are seeing, and I'm completely going to put the horror of the disease to one side. We're seeing some really interesting things as cities around the world take a moment to reflect on how they allocate and use urban space. We've had quite a few cities who have said, oh my God, pedestrians are crammed on a sidewalk. far too close to each other. Let's close the streets to cars and give pedestrians some space. And of course, we're all looking at that going, do you think? But finally, mayors and towns and cities everywhere are suddenly realizing just how little space pedestrians had. And that is a welcome thing. For me, one of the really interesting things here is the breaking habits. So I've not talked about it today, but I've done a lot of research over the years on habits, which are, we would define as psychologists, we define habits as behaviors that you do without thinking. Because you've done them often in the past, they just get triggered by the situation you find yourself in. And what we've shown there, and what other researchers have shown, is when a behavior is a habit, so for example, when picking the car keys up in the morning is just unthinking, you can't change that by giving people information. You can't change it by changing prices or economic signals. You could put gas up 10 cents a gallon. No one changes their behavior. It doesn't work because people are stuck in these habitual patterns. The only time you can change your habitual behavior is when there is a break in a person's life. For example, moving house, new job, going to college, having a child. These are the big ones, but this is one. People have been forced for the first time in years to think about their everyday travel behaviors, and this is an opportunity to give them new habits. One of the things that is very interesting, this is probably the most controversial thing, and again, this is where we all go, do you think? We've suddenly got people who have spent the last 5 years driving fast in SUVs, who are now, as soon as COVID-19 appears, they're going, oh, don't people realize that their actions might hurt a stranger? And we're going, well, yes, we do realize that because you've been buzzing me with your car for the last 5 years. But isn't it interesting how you now notice that each of us has a responsibility to the people around us, and each of us could harm a stranger without intending to? It feels like there's a message there we might remind people of in the future. Just as a fourth point, it's very interesting to see a lot of countries, including mine, suddenly deciding that socialism is quite a good idea after all. So that's been very interesting. And, is it going to make us reflect? To what extent? I think it's been fascinating how quickly we've got used to video conferencing, how quickly, I've just been doing everything by video call recently. It's great. Are we going to commute as we did in the past forever when we go back to normal? Are we going to take advantage of these opportunities and these new ways of working, which clearly work for a lot of us, and make this the new normal? So they were my hot thoughts. And at that point, I will say thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry I went very slightly too long, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions about any of this.
It's okay, Ian. Thanks so much. It was very much worth it. I'm going to just jump in and ask, relate to you one question from Tom Lindberg, who's asked, I think he's asking whether at present, in the midst of all of these issues regarding public space and proximity and public space, are you or others who practice in the academy or in this discipline being called upon to collaborate with government or transportation planners about how to handle it? Or is it just there's too much of a focus on the public health crisis over the virus for people to give a thought to trying to tap into your insights from this research and the scholarship you're doing?
Yeah, at the moment, I don't think there's much call. The ability for people who work in universities to get to government is always variable. Sometimes they come and ask us things, which is great. We love it when they do. Sometimes we try and pass things to them. At the moment, I'm not aware of much happening from me or my colleagues. Several, I think about 20 of us from the UK travel research community very early on wrote an open letter to the government urging them not to ban cycling and just stressing the importance of it for exercise and health, mental health, and for critical journeys during this period. And I do think that worked. And the reason I say that is the letter we sent contained one slightly unusual phrase, and the Prime Minister used it in his briefing, which suggests it did get read. So hopefully that did have some impact there. But I don't think there's much formal going on. I think everything's so focused on the disease itself that just the advice here is just please don't travel as much as possible.
There was another question posed that harkens to the first part of your presentation. I know that you were planning on doing the race across the United States, and that plan has fallen through, of course. But do you have any other major race or endurance event in your sights over the near term this year, maybe next?
Well, I think this year is going to, we'll just have to see what happens, I think. Yes, so I had a place in the Transamerica race, which is the coast-to-coast unsupported race, and I was quite excited about that. I think that would have been quite an interesting experience for a lot of reasons. Obviously, that's postponed for a year. The thing I'm quite keen to do this year is I just want to do some slightly silly things. I want to just set myself some slightly crazy challenges that aren't races, hopefully take other people along. But I just want to do some things like, for example, I really want to just get a map of the country and do the alphabet. So find a town that begins with A, and one that begins with B, and one that begins with C, and just do that. You know, obviously that's easier in a dense country like ours than sparse. You don't want to do that out west in the States.
There's a thing called an Etch-a-Sketch ride that some people do where they try to trace a pattern so that when they have their route shown on Strava or ride with GPS afterwards, it makes a design or even a pictogram.
Yes, that's probably a lot easier where you've got your grid system cities. We have lots of medieval streets which don't really lend themselves to that sort of thing. So yeah, I just want to do these sort of slightly silly personal challenges this year.
So we're almost done, but there was a question posed, and I'm just going to paraphrase it and expand it a little bit because it's so fascinating to me. We've got a president who, when he was trying to get everyone back to work by last weekend, said, come on, we have 40,000 people a year killed in motor vehicle collisions, and no one says shut down the economy. It's something we live with. It's a cost of business in a modern industrialized country. So why is everyone shedding these crocodile tears over this virus? And then we have a mayor of New York City who is really at a completely different part of the political spectrum, but has a very similar set of blinders on when it came to calls for opening up streets, limiting or removing motor vehicle traffic so that there could be space for people to safely recreate. When they're locked down 23 out of 24 hours a day, they want to get out, and they want to get out with more than 6 feet between each of them and not get run over and not have to walk for a half a mile to a park. Politicians from really very different parts of the traditional political spectrum will have amazing unanimity on this exception status for motor vehicles, which is something you also talked about. What do you make of that? The fact that it's an underlying consensus between these traditional left and right distinctions, and we can't get satisfaction for more public space, for more safer, more pleasant active transportation like walking and bicycling out of anywhere we see on this traditional political spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I think that's why I kept talking about culture, because people on different parts of the political spectrum, or grid if you prefer that approach, tend to differ on lots of things, but there will always be aspects of underlying culture, and this is just one that is shared. I think it's several things. I think it's just the fact that, driving has become synonymous with mobility, as I said. There's other things as well, though. So a colleague of mine over in London did some really nice work showing how in societies like ours, alternatives to driving, so cycling being the best example, are constructed as play. And I think we've all had this of, get out of my way, go and do that in the park. when in fact we're making a transport journey. And our cultures also have that problem. And so I think you have to understand that for most politicians, as for most people, when you say, I want 15% of this street to ride my bike, what they hear is, I want 15% of this street to play table tennis. I want 15% of this street to kick a ball about. That's what they're hearing, because to them, this is play. And so that it's not the whole story, but I think that's another part of the reason for these things.
Okay, well, I hear what you're saying, absolutely. And in fact, the section of the code in New York State that concerns bicycles particularly is called Bicycles and Play Devices. It's a single section.
Interesting. Yeah.
The last question is, what was that phrase that made its way from the Golden Memo and were perhaps the last word uttered by your Prime Minister before he was checked in?
Yeah, it was the phrase private green space, with green space as a single word. Very strange, but yeah, he used it in the briefing. You know, we need people to have access to private green space, but that's not a phrase. That's not a term I've ever seen before. It just, someone slipped it into this letter somewhere and was in the briefing.
Okay, well, we'll have to pick it up here too. It sounds like it's a winner. Thank you so much for staying up so late at night.
No, very happy.
Share these thoughts with us. And thanks everyone for joining. We're going to do this another time next week. We've got Peter Flax, editor-in-chief of Bicycling Magazine, big cyclist himself. He's going to have a lot to say about a lot of different things that he's covered as a journalist in the area of cycling, from covering the Tour to covering advocacy issues here. And I think it will be very enjoyable.
Super. Well, thank you so much from me. Stay safe, New York. Hope everyone's okay.
You too.